She's done many international residencies and traveled extensively, and I think I'm going to turn it over to her. She has about 20 books under her belt already and a goal of 50.
Oh, I think I need that. The mic. We're live streaming, so.
Don't touch the red.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Diane. I just want to say hello, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And this has really turned out to be much more than I had expected. And I think partly it's because of this. So I came here to work on the scent of my father. My father died about 8 years ago. And they were, when I was growing up, well, I'll tell you the little story, but let me tell you about this first, and then I'll pass it around so people have a chance to look at it. I'm just seeing it for the first time, and I want to thank Marmy for designing it for me. So, you know, the whole notion of scent is very much one of the most prominent senses that, well, I think intuition, but they say smell. And when I think about my father, and my memory of my father is all connected with the scent of smell. He would take my sister and I to the beach every Sunday before it was open, and he would swim us out one at a time on his back. So when I think of my father, I think of the sea. But he also loved to garden, and so he would always be walking around in the backyard in his shorts and digging in the soil and things like that. And you know, coming from Jamaica, you hear about Idaho, and it's like, what is this place? You know? And so when I came, I thought, okay, I wanted to really move beyond the stereotype, move beyond what I thought I knew or didn't know, and really get to know some people. And so I thought, okay, let me engage them in a similar project like what I'm doing. So I would ask two questions. What's the scent of your father? What is the scent or the essence of your father that you remember? And then a memory of you and him. And I was only going to do 20. I ended up doing 35. Don't ask me how. And so what I did, I interviewed people and I recorded what they wrote, and then I extrapolated and did a little twist to it, but pretty much verbatim, almost verbatim what they wrote. It's just that I wrote it more in a poetic form. So this is the end result, and Marmy designed it for me, which I'm very happy. And so I'm going to pass it around, but do not be distracted. It will be here when I'm done. So let me just say this about this project. I really felt that I got to know people. Because when you say to someone in a very personal way, you know, what is the memory of your father? What is the scent of your father? I think it really gets to the core. And it's amazing how much I feel I have gotten from people as a result of that. And so for me, it was a very rewarding project. In fact, I was saying to Diane today, I think I might have to do that when I go home. You know, a similar project in Jamaica, and maybe even include it in my own book that I'm writing, because I think these little vignettes, these little pieces of history, and oftentimes the history that never gets told, are so important. So I think they're 35 rather than 20. And in fact, I had said to Diane and also to Jody, I had said, boy, I don't even know if I'll be able to get those many people, you know, what if people don't want to do it? And people were so forthcoming and so willing. I mean, except for one or two persons who said that their experience with their father was so bad, they didn't want to share it. People were very willing. So I'm very grateful. I want to thank all of you, and some of you are here who responded to that. And I want to thank also the other persons who are not here. And I'm a photographer. I haven't done it extensively lately. So I also took a picture of each person. So that's what this is. All right. So I've been writing this book about my father, and I said I was going to finish it. I didn't. But I got a lot more ideas. I wrote a number of pages, and I'm going to read some of the pages I wrote. But primarily what happened for me is that it opened up the book for me in other ways. And I think partly through doing these interviews, in that now I found that there were other elements. One of the sections I'm going to read is a section that I probably would never have written if I wasn't here and every morning walking the Boise River. So what happens in one of these places when you're away from home and in a sense you carry a different sensibilities and openness to the project is that it opens up other spaces. So it has opened up other spaces for me. And when I go home, I'm going to spend the rest of September hoping to knock out the first draft. And also in the first section that has already been written, I'm seeing places where I can add more, this whole notion of scent, not just smell, but the essence, you know, that I remember in various places. So the book it's not a biography of my father, although I've done some research and I've asked questions of an older cousin and others. But it's really it was me trying to get to know my father better now that he has died. It might seem ironic, but also trying to fill some gaps that occurred. And I'll tell you why the gaps occurred. So when my parents divorced and I was 10, my father left Jamaica and moved to the USA, and he didn't communicate with us for 10 years. And so there was always that sense of absence, and I had to go through therapy to work that out, you know, once we were reunited. So I feel like there's some essential spaces in my life and gaps in my life that, as a result of that 10 years of separation, that I didn't have. And I've written essays that have been published about that already, but this is a different way of approaching it. I'm also trying to remember or trying to reimagine what my father's first 6 years of life was. So I'll give you a little backstory. In 1912, there was a hurricane, and it impacted certain parishes in Jamaica, including St. Anne, which is the parish where my father is from. And as a result of which, many Jamaicans went to Cuba because Cuba was still booming to work. And my paternal grandfather was a tailor, and my paternal grandmother was a seamstress. So they went there following the tobacco and the cane workers and primarily sewing for them. And so my father and his sister, like many Jamaicans of that generation from a number of parishes in Jamaica, were actually born in Trinidad, in Cuba. And my father spoke Spanish until he was 6, and I didn't learn that until very late. So the book is, this piece is really trying to remember that and trying to imagine from the little bits and pieces that my grandmother, his mother, told me about what their life was like then to what I know it was from the other stories that I got from him and my mother and other people. So I'm going to start by reading a few pages of what I've written here. Now, the Caribbean, and you know, it's not just the Caribbean, but I know that it is still very much a part of, we believe, your placenta, the placenta that is very important part of your life. And so until very recently, when one was born, and of course a lot of people were born at home, with midwives, the placenta was buried under a tree, and that tree was said to represent your life. And so this is it. My father's placenta was planted under a purple jacaranda tree, a tree known for its fragrant smell. It was in the yard of the midwife, a tan-colored woman with unruly hair, who appointed herself my father's godmother. To my grandmother's consternation, she had spat into my father's mouth, uttering, "Tu pretense aquia, you belong here," before handing him to my grandmother to breastfeed. Although my grandmother had planned to bury the placenta in the backyard in which they lived, under the avocado seed she had sitting in a jar, roots crowding the bottom of the jar ready to sprout out, she decided that a jacaranda tree with its intoxicating aroma would provide safe passage for my father wherever he ventured, and would, as his godmother announced on his first birthday, the roots of his scent would Atramuriras allure all kinds of women to him. And might I just add, it did. When they returned home to Jamaica, she worried her husband until he got her a lignum vitae seedling. And in the early morning, as she dug up a hole herself by sunrise at the side of the house and planted the shrivel up navel string, the umbilical cord, she had secured in an old, once white, now beige handkerchief, tenderly and sacredly she patted the soil, declaring in a small sing-song tone, "You will be strong and durable as the tree, and nothing go destroy you." As a boy, my father, while still in Cuba, visited the rivers with the other boys in the neighborhood. They romped, splashed, taught each other to swim, competed who was the fastest, and caught shrimps before heading home with their little tin cans, some full, others just a handful of shrimp. My father didn't know the names of the river, but in school he learned that the Catua, the Toa, the Guama, and the Yumuri were the largest rivers in Cuba. The cool water running over his feet, the bubble of the water talking as it glides over stone and bends her body to navigate the curves of the land, filled him with wonder and awe. She was an endless kite tail, sometimes moving slowly and softly, and in other places she raged and flung her body in flight. While still in Cuba, a young boy, my father moseyed to the rivers with some of the neighborhood boys. Once there, sweaty and hot, they flung themselves in the river, gulped mouth after mouthful of water, laughing and romping, splashing and shoving, pushing and tugging one another before turning to swim, teaching others how to swim, competing who was the farthest. As a teenager back in his parents' home in Jamaica, my father often slunk away with the other boys and spent the day at the river, catching janga, which is what we call shrimp, and tiki-tiki fish, teaching the other boys how to swim, diving into the deep pools, sitting under the falls, his back pressed against a rock, the water beating down on his head, temporarily blinding him, thumping his shoulder, rushing over his body, leaving it streaked white in places. Sometimes, in the shallow section, the stones and gravel scraped and grazed his soles. School of fry darted around his feet, and he tried to scoop them in his cupped palms. For him, the river was magical and tranquil, inviting and adventurous, a complete mystery even when he spent the whole day traveling its trail and rapids until it was embraced by the sea. He knew these rivers' names: White, Great, Duns, Roaring, Cave, and looked more throttily than White, strong arms as its flow was always strong and wide, tumbling down as Duns was continuously tumbling down. He kept the name Cave for that of all the names seems more appropriate. He renamed Pedro at the bend due to its location. At certain quiet moments when he sat alone in his room, but more often outside, lying on his back, the ground his bed, he would stretch out his legs straight as well as his arms, palms facing the sky, and he would imagine, actually feel tributaries of river running through his vein with his blood, rivers bending and twisting and colliding too, like old friends totally happy and therefore unashamed to run and embrace each other and hold on tightly. The three main tributaries in Cuba, Salado, Bañano, and I'm probably saying these wrong because my Spanish is terrible, Contramastre, hugging up White and Great River, who in turn introduced them to Cave and Pedro and the grand dame of all, Duns River. The excitement of the rivers meeting filled my father with such delight that he would tramp and splash around until startled by his mother's voice asking why he was so soaked, as if he had stolen away and gone to the river. He would look down at his wet clothes bewildered, but also with realization of the power of his mind and the strength of the rivers to lure him from so far, as he was certain at one point he was thrashing about the Cantu River, the largest in Cuba, and that had risen after a heavy downpour, and it was taking him down fast, and he was struggling to stay afloat and find a trunk or a bamboo reed to hold on, and find a mild spot from where he could climb to shore, so he didn't want to be washed up and half drowned at the Gulf of Guanaycanyaba. He loved the sea as much as the river. Perhaps because the boat on which they were traveling to return to Jamaica nearly capsized, my father was adventurous, causing his mother to lose all her many lives before he was even a teenager. His ears were always plugged when she called him, and even his father came to accept that he was invisible or disappeared when he had done something wrong and was due a flogging. But it was hard to be upset or mad with him too long. A jinnle of a smile would disarm you. His mother therefore began to turn her back to him whenever the rare occasion warranted him a scolding, because if she said to him, "Stand up straight and look at me when I'm talking to you," his boyish charm would overpower her, and she would end up pulling him in and hugging him close and asking him what he wanted for dinner and cooking that rather than what she had planned, for even her husband had requested. So that's some of the new section. And this is another part of the new section. And this is part of towards the end of the book. The scent of my father, abandonment. No odor, abandonment. No odor, my mind sniffs to draw forth memories. He shirtless in the garden, shrouded by a field of callaloo, which is like kale or spinach. He shrouded by a field of callaloo, a single line of sweat trails down his backbones. Tomatoes still green entice his fingers to work, but yams, heart-shaped leaves, a polished wetness demand in his eyes. Rain like a drought push out new life. 10 years, no scent. 10 years, neither musk, nor breath, nor odor. Erased, washed away, no odor. Anger, left without protection, no odor. Where are you? Where have you been? We have told so many stories of abandonment. What is the smell of abandonment? What is the smell of regret, rage, sadness? No odor. For endless years, then, dear daughter, smelling of a promise, a letter to reunite after those drought years. Manure permeates that bridge. The scent will drive away even a convert. Odor. More odor, most odor. Can I conjugate the smell, dissect its part like a sentence? This is the smell of noun, the verb, the direct and indirect object. Or was I just to sniff out the objective clause? Odor. He, daddy, the subject, smelled like a lie. He, daddy, the verb, was pungent. The object was sour. Sour, no longer odorless. The memory suffocates. Open the window, please. Odor, abandonment, no smell. Sniff, sniff, sniff. So that's those two sections. I know one or two of you here are writers or planning to write or will be writing. And, you know, the process of writing a book, well, I think it changes depending on what you're writing. And for me, because this is a journey to remember my father and to honor my father, whom I love, the process changes. And it's interesting when I'm writing those sections about Cuba, or even writing how he and my mother met, you know. And back then, there were not a lot of cars, and they both rode bicycles. And so they met. No, actually, I want to tell you the story. And this is a true story about how my mother and father met for the first time. They used to ride bicycles when they were courting. So my father, like many Jamaicans during World War II, enlisted in the ROTC, which was the Jamaican section of the army. And the British government had promised that those men from the West Indies that were their colony, if they enlisted in the war, they would provide them with a college education. So his mother said, "You're going," right? And then the British government had not anticipated or didn't care that so many West Indian men went, and they reneged on their promise. And so my father was due home, and his mother, and my grandmother lived to be 102, and she you don't play with this woman. She say to him, "You ain't coming home a damn until you get a degree." And she had retired. She was a seamstress, and she went back to work so that my father could stay and get a degree. And he trained to be a chemist and a city planner. Now, my mother was to have been a nurse, but she didn't like nursing. So she went to business school, and the very first job she got was with the Jamaican Banana Board as secretary to the executive. And the very first letter she typed was a letter to my father telling him that he was employed as a chemist to the Banana Board. And whenever she told me that story and my father corroborated, I just thought, boy, that was kind of destined. Your first job, his first job, at that place. And so my father first and my mother first worked at the Banana Board, and then my father worked as a chemist at the sugar estate, converting sugar into rum and drawing too much, which is another story on why the demise of the marriage. So now this was from the stories my grandmother used to tell of my father's birth, and it's called His Birth in Foreign Land. He, my father, was born before his mother could complete the dress for the Cuban woman who lived down the road. The woman had begged Grandma to sew her a dress that hugged her body to welcome the man who was returning, a man the woman hadn't seen in more than 10 years. Tears made the woman's eyes glow as she hugged the burgundy rayon weighed down by desire, drier than 2 summers without rain, that left the banana leaves looking like singed tobacco. She, my grandmother, reached for the flare sleeve to attach to the body of the dress when the water spilled from between her legs. "Just so," she mused. "I didn't even feel that I want to pee." She raised her right foot from the new painted black pedal and looked over to her husband standing just across from her, the heavy iron in his hand, steaming the pants he had just made. Grandma could not remember her husband's name. As pain traveled down her spine, she forgot the sound of words as a contraction knotted her breath, making her gasp. But she heard her husband, who had forced her to move away from the family and all that was familiar to work in Cuba, where money was to be had, he said, where they were treated worse than dogs, wherever they traveled beyond the small town in which they lived, and from which she now refused to budge. The second contraction thrusted her forward with such force she shoved the sewing machine aside and landed on her knees, groaning. He was beside her, his warm palms bracing her elbow, trying to help her to rise. But the third contraction surged through her, and she managed simultaneously to pull free of him and shout, "Left me alone, just let me make me dead." As she squatted, her back braced against the wall, images of her mother and sisters flooded her, and not being able to see them, not being able to assist her at this moment, magnified the pain and tears. From the pain she could never have imagined, elicited more tears that gushed from her eyes, and as she squatted there, pulling the dress she had promised the lady she would make, joking that she would look like a virgin bride welcoming her husband, the same unfinished dress in which there were pins, one of which pricked Grandma's finger, and on which she now wiped her bleeding hand, then mopped up the water from her busted water bag. She didn't want to die in this strange land, not too far from home, but far enough, where they spoke in a language she did not understand, and where many did not like black people, people as dark as her and her husband, a shade before midnight. The injustice of it caused her chest to heave, and she moaned, rolling on the ground, bawling, not for the baby that would die if she died, but for the people she loved that she would never see again. And the sadness of her life, which was not at all sad, caused more anguish. Her husband turned away from her, moving towards the door of the 2-room dwelling they rented to live in and in which she sewed. He was now hollering to the air, as far as she was concerned, hollering at the day, "Patera, patera, get the patera." Even as the midwife arrived, Grandma clutched the woman's dress and would not let go as she was led into the back room that served as bedroom and living room, and when it rained, the kitchen, a room made for a child but which held a double bed and bolts of cloths and shelves that her husband had erected, shrinking and entombing the room so that her life was nothing but cloth and thread and other people's clothes. She did not wish to be consoled, was irritated by the gyrating sound of the patera's voice intoning, "Respirar, respirar." Grandma brushed the patera's hand from her shoulder and abdomen, refused to lay in the bed, instead crawled on her knees to rest against the wall with snot dripping from her nose. She hollered like a child, "No one go home, no one go home." And that's how her second child, my father, was born, spilling onto the wooden floor before the patera, catching him in time and immediately wrapping him in the soft white cotton towel my grandma had sewn, then soaked in rainwater with a handful of mint leaves, then left to dry slowly under the shade of a tree. Then and only then was grandma ready to rise from her knees, to look at the child she had carried almost as long as an elephant. Despite what they all said, she knew she had been pregnant for more than 10 months, maybe 17. I laughed when she told me this. With firm hands, the patera forced Grandma to remain on her knees while she cut the cord with what looked like the butcher's knife her husband used to slice the goat skin from the meat. Her afterbirth sat hard as rock inside my grandmother's stomach as the patera handed the child to the father. "Empuji, empuji," she commanded my grandmother, pressing down on her abdomen. "Empuji, empuji." Recognizing that she might still get the chance to return home and hug her mother and hold her sisters, and Grandma pushed, sweat lacing her body. She grunted as though constipating, pushing the patera aside until she was on all fours like a dog, relieving itself. The placenta spilled out from her and she keeled over on her side. When she regained consciousness, her husband was at her side, pressing a cold cloth on her forehead, and the baby was suckling at her nipples. "Is what?" she whispered. "Our son," he replied. Laughter spread throughout her body. Sweet tears stained her cheeks. She looked down at the child she had carried for far too many months, the boy who was now her son. And she knew she would love him even beyond her own death, and would love him as light graces day. And I have to say, my grandmother loved my father unashamedly, unabashedly, unconditionally, and no matter what he did, she always find a reason to explain what he did. And though I don't remember the full details, I remember my mother saying, even when she told my grandmother that she's going to leave my father because he was womanizing, my grandmother said, "He's not womanizing, Kathy. He's just helping other women." And I guess there are different ways, right? This section is called Shameful. And I also should say, if you have questions, we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, but sometimes you might have a question in the middle, and I don't mind being interrupted. So in Cuba, part of the Afro-Cuban religion is called Santeria. And so in the community that my grandmother and other Jamaicans lived, Santeria was practiced a lot. After the Santeria opened my father's eyes, my grandmother was declared healthy to resume her duties as a wife. My grandfather had been cooking, caring for my grandmother and his new son while keeping the shop open. And although it was January and well after Christmas, he was busier than ever. My grandmother could hear the pedaling of the sewing machine and the scrimping of scissors on cloth every time she woke to feed their son. She was mother to another child, Sissy, my father's 4-year-old sister, who had been carted off the week before by her godmother and my grandmother's only friend who lived in the next town. Too busy with her own 5 children and the little bakery she ran out of her kitchen to come visit with my grandmother more than once a month, when she brought her the thick bread, practically dripping with butter, the crust glazed with watery sugar. My grandmother was the only seamstress in this village, and after she had darned the dress for the richest woman in town, who now condescended to come to her for all her dresses because her dresses were so good, if not better than the ones her husband paid handsomely to have made in Spain, my grandmother was swamped not just by local women who shaved off a little money from buying oil and flour to have a dress made from calico or burlap for a birthday or a wedding, but by the rich white women who bought damask, silk, chantilly, lace, chiffon, gingham, herringbone, linen, and even lame. The dress my grandmother was sewing when she went into labor was a delicate muslin as golden as the sun. It had been washed, but the blood stain was evident as my grandmother lay in bed trying to think. She simply sucked her teeth and turned to admire her son, refused to even bathe, so Ezekiel, her husband, had to fill a basin with water and bring it to her. On the 5th day, a group of women from the village came and rapped on her door before they barged in, claiming they wanted to make sure for themselves that her son was well, to see the perfect son the patera said he had been. Brought the child a piece of yam, a hand of banana, 2 stalks of cane, and sweet sops. Nothing he could eat, but she would, so he in turn would taste the starchy tuber on the sugary flesh of her breast. The woman scrutinized all and asked her if she fell ill, when she replied, "No, I just don't feel like getting up and taking as much time to enjoy my son." The women were amazed and openly said, "Usted umba muera en mala estado." You're a spoiled woman. You take advantage. But my grandmother didn't care, though she knew a pile of fabric awaited her. For a whole week, my grandmother stayed inside and allowed her husband to wait on her hand and foot. She had only gotten a day when her daughter was born, so she never felt as if she had bonded with her or breastfed without being at the sewing machine. Now her son was getting full attention, and so she didn't get up when the woman from the other end of the lane passed by the house on the 6th day and shouted, "He ought to throw her out." My grandmother uttered, turning on her side towards the wall. On the 8th day, when the sun came hollering through the window, grandmother rose, shielded my father's face in one of her blankets, and went to sit on the top of the stoop. She waved howdy to anyone who passed, and they responded, "Hola," paused to ask after her health, or stepped inside to peep at her son. It was only then my grandmother admitted, "It's like me memory turn on me. I remember Sissy, my daughter, and me want to hug her up too and make her see her brother. I send me mind to her and my friend who keeping her, and just so, next morning, bright and early, me hear clippity-clap and a deep voice calling out, 'En la casa, en la casa.' Your grandpa got up and peeped through the window, your father in my arms, and me see her little head. Me almost drop your father, but me gather myself, run outside barefoot. His sissy sit down in a basket on the donkey, her hair braided and parted in two big ribbons almost covered her head. Your grandpa reach her first and hug her to him chest, when me reach her and hold your father in one hand and hug her in the other and kiss her all over her face and neck and hand. Me happy can done. Me was the happiest day in Cuba. The man who bring her some friend maybe send her, and she sent 2 of the biggest bread your grandpa ever see. Lord, it's sweet, it's sweet, it's sweet. Me had to put down your father, sissy hug me neck tight and just a smile, and we sit on the bed and put her on her lap and put your father upon her lap. And Ezekiel, your grandfather, came in the room, look on us, and his face is a moon. Him say, she is the prettiest child him ever did see, and if him could paint, everyone would want the picture. My grandmother reported that that was the first and only day since they set up shop that no sewing took place. They ate some of the bread the man brought with guava jam, and the four of them cuddled in the bed and slept almost the whole day. But before darkness, she remembered her wifely duties, stewed the chicken Grandpa had killed, made rice and peas, and they sat at the little table near the window and ate and washed down what was left with limeade and licked their fingers when they were done. Then they slept, my grandmother insisting that her children be on either side of her, though Sissy had her own bed that grandfather made himself. And so they slept, and the night was an angel in their ear. Can I get a little water, please? I meant to bring a little water for myself. So, you get all of these stories, and what we remember, what I say to people is all the stories we know of ourselves and that we tell about ourselves is fabrication anyway. My sister and I lived in the same house until we were 19, and my sister has such different memory of some of the same incidents. It's just like night and day. And so when my grandmother was a storyteller, and she would tell me all these stories, and I'm thinking, is this really real? But anyway, she insists. And my father was indeed a bright man. I thought he was a very bright man, and he accomplished a lot. In fact, it was much older that I learned that Jamaica being one of the large islands in the Caribbean, and also one of the islands that, besides Barbados, that had one of the most educated groups, would send workers from other islands to do things. So my father, after he left sugar cane, he went to work with city planning because he had studied that also in London. And so he told me, again, I was trying to find data on it, but he was sent from Jamaica to help design the city of Belize. So there you have it. But anyway, my grandmother said my father was bright from the day he was born. And so this story is about him starting school. Thank you. Grandma said, Daddy, my father, began going to big school when he was only 3 years old. Then upon reflection, that's why I don't like them Cuban people up to now. They just come into my house like it's theirs and tell me what to do. Is that brown-skinned woman put her mouth on your daddy? Senor Delgada is what everyone called her, even those who didn't like her. She walked around with her nose up in the air as if her feet weren't walking on dirt like the rest of us. And then people whispered about her and her soft, wavy hair that almost touched her back. And she had the best school for boys only, and only people who did not labor in the fields could afford to attend. Grandma was surprised when Senora Delgada entered her house and asked her to sew a dress. The senora learned all about my grandmother after she sighted a woman in a well-crafted dress in the street and asked and was told Grandma had made it. Since then, almost a year, Senora Delgada came regularly with fabric she got from New York and had Grandma make her dresses or blouses or skirts, but always with the firm command, no one else must have this style. It was when she was trying to explain a design to Grandma, resorting to Spanish as she could not think of the English word, when Daddy, your father, began to talk to her and said to his mother, pleated in the back, then ran back to sit on the steps and continued his play with the seeds and sticks he has collected. As she left, Senor Delgado patted his head, and Daddy responded in perfect Spanish, que tenga un buena, whatever he said. Anyway, surprised at his articulation and understanding, Senora Delgado marched back into the house and said, this boy is intelligent. Make sure he's at my school on Monday. Grandma tried to explain that Daddy was only 3 and they could not afford her school, that there was no one to take him, that the 3-mile walk was too far. But Senora Delgado would hear nothing of it, even threatening to have her husband, an officer, bring charges against them if my father was not in school. And this is exactly what my grandmother did. Grandpa told Grandma to stop arguing. They would find a way to send Daddy on school on Monday. And Senor Delgado would see that he was not ready, and that would be the end of that. Saturday evening, Senor, whom everyone called Milkman, who lived at the end of the lane and had cows and sold milk and whose wife ran a little shop selling food, stopped to inform Grandpa that Senora Delgado said he was to pick up Daddy on Monday and bring him along with his 2 boys to her school. In exchange, Grandpa would sew his boys' school uniform for free. Grandpa nodded his consent, and even before Senor was out the gate, Grandpa lit into Grandpa. After Senor had gone, you're making these people rule our life. How that woman can come order us to send our son to her school? How come she can make arrangements for him to go there, and all you're saying is he will be ready? How Dada gonna wake up so early and travel so far? Don't you see him as a little boy? How is he going to understand what they're teaching him when that woman only speaks Spanish and the youngest boy in that school is 8 and Dada is only 3? Dada not supposed to start school before him sister Sissy. Is walking distance. Senor and his son leave before morning wash sleep from its mouth and don't return until after sun shut its door. You expect my little boy to travel that far every day? I don't like that woman, Just come into my house and tell me what to do with my own child. Sweat dampened Grandma's skin as Grandpa looked at her, not a word parting his lips. Grandma just marched over to where he had the sleeve and pocket to a shirt he was making neatly laid out and tossed them on the ground and stepped on them before storming out the room. That's why I divorced your grandfather, she told me. And take my children with me after we return to Jamaica. That man never take up for me, never take up for himself. I couldn't get him to say a word in defense. Just go along like he was a paper boat being led by the current of the water. Grandma got up early Monday morning, bathed Daddy, fed him cornmeal porridge with cinnamon, and gave him 2 Johnny cakes, which are flour cakes we call Johnny cakes, carefully wrapped in a cloth pouch she had made the night before, and put on his school uniform that Grandpa made the night before. Grandma and Grandpa stood by the gate and waited for the clippity-clop of Senor's mule, drawing his milk cart. He arrived with his 2 boys, 9 and 8, sleep still lounging in their eyes. Grandpa hoisted Daddy into the cart, but when Grandma realized that the boys were sitting on old rags and Daddy would have to sit on the rough yew floor, she begged Senor to hold on and hurried inside, pulled the cushion she had sewn for herself from her work chair, put it in Senor's milk cart, and put Daddy to sit on it. Then he was off. I tell you, I wave and wave with my right hand and clutch my belly with the left. Long after your grandfather go in the house and I couldn't even hear or see Senor's milk cart, I so worried I take Sissy to school late. I burn up the lunch, needle stick me, my head hurt all day until me hear the clippity-clop of the mule, them coming back. Me and Sissy stand by the gate waiting, son already gone for the day. Your daddy was fast asleep when we take him from the cart. He was so tired he hardly eat. After me bathe him and fall asleep right again, I said to myself, me not gonna send him back next morning. But your little daddy wake up and say, Mama, school. And it's so him big school start. Him go to school with the big boys until 2 days before we leave Cuba. Who could have tell me that child's so smart? And this chapter goes on, but I'm going to stop there. This is another section with learning to sew, my father learning to sew. Again, there are all of these fantastic tales about my father. He was a little genius child, I guess. When my father turned 4 years old, my grandfather decided he was old enough to begin learning his trade. No matter the times, people would always want clothes to make them look and feel good. So he pulled a chair, hoisted my father on it, then pushed the boy in the chair in front of his work table and handed him some fabric and instructed him, Run your hand over them and tell me what you feel. My father, who had been fingering fabric all his life, especially those given to him by his mother to keep him quiet, was already proficient about texture and being a keen observer on which color looked best on whom. The fabric his father gave him lacked luster, being only dark brown, gray, and navy blue. He knew the difference between linen and gabardine, I still don't, and wool. And like the ones, he said, holding the sample of linen, the color of mud above his head, my grandmother, who had higher plans for her son and daughter, entered the room and stood by the threshold watching her husband, instructed her son. It's long time in my mind that neither sissy nor your daddy gonna learn to sew. Not one pants or dress them sewing. Dress trapped me in Cuba, pedaling that machine day and night, even in my sleep. I could feel myself pedaling and reaching for blouse or shirt or dress. I decide this sacrifice is for my children. The sacrifice of missing home and family and all that familiar for my children. They're not going to sew. They're not sewing. They're not stitching a button. They're not hemming a dress. Aunt Sissy at 6 could already sew on a button on a shirt as neat as Grandpa without pricking her fingers with the needle. And Grandpa had no doubt that Dada would be the same, but she whispered as if Grandpa was still around, I would rather him learn to cook than mend a pants. Every time your Grandpa called your daddy, I would say, Dada, and she called him Dada. What the whole family called him. Dada has to do this, Dada has to do that. I kept him away from the cloth. I did not want him to become a tailor like his father. Better to learn to cook like a woman. Better to cackle than to be a tailor. She rubbed her eyes and clasped her hands. Your father did bright, calm, done, not a thing he couldn't do. You just had to show him once. Even without showing him, he could just watch. And the next thing you know, he better than the master. No, your grandfather was a master tailor. I ain't taking that from him. He could make the ugliest man look good in a suit. The skinniest man look like he have body. Your grandfather was a master tailor. But I was not going to make your daddy, my son, come a tailor. Better him cook like a woman. Better him laugh. I determined my son not going to get trapped indoor all the livelong day behind a machine. No, sir, no, sir. I make sure your grandfather don't teach him, but him learn anyway. I should have known. The 4 of us live in 2 little rooms and the rest of the cottage nothing but sewing thread and cloth and needles and buttons and hook and eye everywhere, every day and night. One Saturday, sister and I go to the market and leave your father with your grandpa. I come back and your dad is sitting on your grandpa's lap, connecting sleeve to suit. As soon as I walk in the house of them, the told of them calling to me, Mama, come look. Come look, see how good this boy is? I can retire now and let him take over for me. I'm so mad, I just kiss my teeth and walk with the basket of food to the kitchen. But when we sit down to eat that Saturday, soup, I give my children them soup, and your grandfather didn't get even a teaspoon. That teach him about taking my boy to turn tailor. I vex. But I also proud. Here was this little boy who could read books and go into big school, Senora Delgado school with the big children. And here he was, able to connect a sleeve to a suit. And it looked good, you see? I still didn't give your grandfather not even a spoon of soup. So I think that's it.
I feel like we need to wash that down with some limeade and lick our fingers.
Yes!
I'm Jody Eichelberger. I'm the program director here at Searle's Place. And those of you that are on the live stream, if you have a question, we might be able to read that question out, so you can think about that and type that in. I also feel like we need to come up with some better names for the Boise River after all of your
Yes,
names, and it's like Boise River.
I actually started to do some research. I couldn't find any other name. I thought, surely there must be, because I've been walking all over the place.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the Boise River, and it has inspired me to look at the river stories that my father probably
And that was a
encountered.
beautiful section with the waterways.
Yeah.
And this little card that you prepared, if you didn't get one, there's more on the back. The last line is water's memory is timeless.
Yeah.
How does that part of what you've written, and can you say a little more about?
So one of the first long walks I went, maybe it's not so long, was along this route to that bridge where the kids jumped off.
Yeah, the railroad bridge.
The railroad bridge, and I stood there for a long time, and it perked a memory that I remember my father saying about jumping off the bridge, and I had not written about that. And I love the water and I love river. It's too cold for me to swim. I did want to do that, but and so I was thinking, well, the earth and us, we're 3/4 water, right? And there is a place where all of that water connects with us. And so I was thinking that here was it triggering the memory of my father and what he did, and me imagining what he might have done then, so that there was a kind of timelessness that connected all the rivers. So that's how that line came.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I want to ask you a little bit about genre, because you are a person, and if you haven't had a chance to look at the range of books on the desk there, you span a lot of different genres, and I know you've also done academic writing and writing for kids and romantic novels. And just in the text that you read for us tonight, it seemed like I noticed a shift between genres a little bit. The first section felt a lot more narrative. The second section, which I think is meant to be at the end of the book, was more poetic. How do you see what's happening in the work?
Well, first of all, I think the whole notion of genres is an artificial device. And when I was teaching in California, I did design a course which was called Mixed Genre, in which I had students write both poetry and prose and even drama, play. And this last collection of mine, The Storyteller, I call it The Storyteller's Return, which just came out in March. I call it story poems or something like that. Is that what it says? Story poems. And initially when I started this, it was poetry. It was more in the form of poems, and I was working more on the poetic form. And then I realized, and I'm a narrative poet anyway, and then I realized so much of the story I wanted to tell, and that form didn't necessarily work in it. But, when I go back, by the time I get to the third draft of this collection, I am hoping it will be more fused with poetry or prose. So it's called a prose poem. This is what I'm titling this book. And I, even in my academic work, when I write essays, I would infuse it with poems or some other kinds of things, interview other voices. So while I believe there's some people who are strictly poets and strictly prose writer and strictly playwrights, I have written and published in all genre, and I think those forms don't necessarily, it closes me in, and so I like to experiment, and I never quite know what it's going to be till it is.
And I think it will also have to be a recorded work, because getting to hear your voice read it tonight, it's like, I don't know that I want to read it on the page. I want to just hear you read it.
There it is. So there to that too.
That's right.
Dude.
It's also a little bit of a trick. It's very much, at least the parts you read to us. I mean, your grandmother is the main character and the person you really connect with in such meaningful ways. And obviously, this is the early childhood part. But
Right, and she was the one who was telling me the
she
stories.
just comes alive.
Yeah.
In a really meaningful way.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions either on the socials or anybody in the room? It could be about the reading or about Opal's time here in Boise.
What is your grandma's name? We know.
Edith Meleda Palmer. Yeah.
Oh, so you have the Palmer name as part of your name.
Yeah, that's my Maiden name?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
When I went with my family to visit part of the Caribbean, we were on shore walking around, and this guy asked my mom where she was from, and she said Idaho, and he said, "Oh, oh, you don't know?" So you started by saying how
I love that. Jody, did you bring it up?
it happened. I was witness to it. I couldn't watch much longer because I was on the floor. But you mentioned how you heard of Idaho in Jamaica, didn't really know what it was. I'm just wondering your time here and doing the collection of the scent of your father. Like, what are some of the things that you're filling that void with that you now will go home and think about?
Well, first of all, and which is always nice, and it's something I've always known, is that wherever you go, people are people, and we have so much in common. So, some of the people had happy memories, some of the people had mixed memories, but we all have a father, and we all have a specific scent or sense that we associate our fathers with, and we all have a memory of that. And so it is that commonality, that common denominator that allows you then to experience the people as real rather than this is what you think they are, and therefore allow you to connect and have a really good time. So certainly the stories I will tell is that the people are nothing like I thought they were. And in fact, that's what I've been saying. Even my daughter, one of my daughters was saying, "Mommy, it sounds like you're having a really good time." And I said, "Yeah, I'm having a really good time." So, it is just about being open and meeting people where they meet you. And if you meet them with the goodness of your heart, they meet you back there. So.
Well, I
Do you
think
think this would be the hottest place you've ever been?
Now, let me tell you something. This place has done havoc to my skin. It cannot get moist. I have gone through vitamin E. I wake up and it feels like a paper bag. And I'm like, but I put on vitamin E oil. I had not, that I didn't know would happen.
it's fine. It's not necessarily the heat. So
Right, it's very dry. And Jamaica is hot, but there's a little wind, maybe because we're an island. And so there are times when I would want to go outside during the middle of the day, and it was like, nope, you're not going outside. Too hot. So.
Well, Diane will probably agree with me that you are one of the residents that we've had who's been the most active in the community in terms of the things that you've gone to see and done, and the number of people that you've interacted with. Is there an experience that you had that particularly surprised you, or was something unexpected?
I think it was all a little surprise because I didn't expect any of it. But the first few encounters were what made me want to do more. Because, as I said, you come with some preconceived notion, and then you realize that people are okay, and you're okay with people, and so it makes you want to go more. And also because I've never been here, and I'm not sure when I'll be here again, I wanted to see and do as much as I could, and I was very happy that all of these things were happening. I love galleries, and so I was happy to do that, and the concerts and all the things. So I'm really very grateful for you and Diane and others, Jason and Kirsten, and who have just taken me out and showed me and just been hospitable. I think that's the word, yeah.
Well, let's continue being hospitable. I think we'll close this more formal part of our Q&A, but feel free to stick around and talk to Opal directly. And we have some snacks and things back there at the table and some drinks.
Yeah, and I have a few books. I just brought, I think, 2 copies of 2 or 3 books. The new one that just came out, which is a prose poem, and then a children's book, Portia Dreams, which is the authorized biography of Portia Simpson Miller, who is the first female prime minister of Jamaica. It's a children's book. And so the other one, The Storyteller's Return, is an adult book, or a book for anybody, about home, what home means, and returning and that kind of stuff. So.
Thank you, Opal.
Thank you. So I believe that the book, which is really supposed to be a online book will be available on your website, yes? Or where will it be?
We're not sure yet. we have to
Figure
about
out.
Yeah, but,
Okay.
but it was great to be able to see it.
Yeah, for me too.
In
It
the
was,
world today.
it was really
Thank you,
good.
Marnie, for getting that together so quickly.
Yeah.
Um,
And everyone who is in it will make sure that you get a copy, a virtual copy, an ebook as they call it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think your reading lasted about the same length as it took for this to get around the room.
Oh, you know what? Do you mind if I just read maybe 2? Should I read off the people who are here?
Oh, okay.
Huh? Okay. So we'll read Jody's. And I titled these just based on what they say. It's called Motor Oil and Soapy Dog. I need my glasses. My eyes are really in the last, whatever, it's gotten to be that. The Gem State Electric was my dad's anchorage, but a place I wanted to escape from as a teen. The perpetual smell of motor oil, dusty, musty, industrial. My dad with his glasses and shirt unbuttoned, washing our dog Buffy, then holding a soapy Buffy in front of him like an offering.
And Gem State Electric actually is right across from the boulevard on 32nd Street. He was an electrician, and that was my first job.
Is it still there?
The building is.
Saturday mornings. Wint O'Green lifesavers sparkled in his mouth. He chewed on them. A coach, my hero. Every Saturday, Dad treated me at McDonald's. Then we went to hang out with the other coaches. I was Dad Princess. Cindy. Gasoline hands. He smelled of gasoline from pouring oil into the old lawnmower he used to mow our lawn, the first in his Hungarian family to attend college. Proper and straight-postured, he took me fishing in our boat. We caught wellies and bass. Sometimes we would see a beaver, even a moose, but I could tell he was never comfortable. He did it just for me, just to be with me. Greg. And this guy, Diane, took me to Flick, and he was collecting tickets. And I said, would you do it? And he did. And I'm going to read Diane's mom, because she was there, and Diane learned something she had not known. And it's called Walking on His Hands. He smelled like the woods, like fish, like the river. He would walk on his hands with the milk bottles. When I had my tonsils out, Dad had his appendix out at the same time in the same hospital. Dad got out of his bed and walked on his hands down the hall to my room just to cheer me up. I laughed. They had to reduce some of his stitches. And her mother says this is a true story. See, I had to come to bring that out. This is Wallace. I also met him at the theater. As a boy of 6, I would climb into the bed with Grandpa. His bedclothes were musty. In the morning, I watched him shave with a strap and straight razor, soap in the brush. When he was done, he would pat Old Spice on his face and patted my face too. I couldn't have been more than 4 years old. It was upstate New York, and I'm in my snowsuit. My father picked me up. He held me out in front of him, and the look of glee on his face, I could tell he was enjoying me, enjoying being a father. Tickling. Old Spice, and a lot of people wore Old Spice. Oh my God, just about everybody. A lot of people. Anyway, Old Spice and coconut suntan lotion tickled my nostril whenever Dad was near. He was the tickle monster. Lying on the living room floor, he would grab my brothers and my ankles, pulling us down. Then he would tickle us. We squealed, and I only escaped by crying, "I'm going to pee my pants."
One of the things that struck me about it is how many of the scents seem as if they aren't going to be around for another generation.
Definitely. Do people still use Old Spice?
But But even gasoline and
Oh, right.
how many fathers today will have that as a scent associated with them? Not tobacco. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So common, just 1 or 2 generations, and that's not going to be the next generation.
Lithium battery and vape.
Well, yeah.
So, lithium battery.
Smoke fan.
Trying to capture that. The vape I can smell. Yeah. Watermelon.
And this is Donna evolving. Sweet, warm cigar fumes, car oil from working on cars, and wood shavings. He could make anything from wood. He is my calm place, my grounding, the person I would always talk to about the world without judgment. An equal rights champion in the 60s, he didn't approve of me marrying a Nigerian, not his daughter, he said. A long 10-year rift, many years of missed celebrations before he came around. Now he and my husband are friends. I'm happy to know even in your 80s, you can still evolve, still change. Like my dad, he has brought us closer. So, there are these little gems, this little history. This is Philip, and I met him at the African American Black History, yeah. The outdoors. My father smelled like the outdoors, refreshing, clean, discernible, but not overpowering. In the 6th grade, wanting his permission to pierce my ears, I went for a drive with him and asked him to tell me the story again about how in his days getting a gold tooth was the thing. We laughed, and then I asked if I could get my ears pierced. He chuckled, how to say no after his own youthful triumph. That same afternoon, he drove me and I got my ears pierced. And this is Daya, who I saw at the botanical... Yeah. Commands respect. I loved my dad and would watch him shave using a minty soap, then daub in his face with camphor. He was a big guy, tall and muscular. I thought him very handsome and wanted to grow up to be as big and as regal as he. When he took us to church wearing his agagba, his 3-piece African outfit, buba shirt and shokotos pants, he commanded respect. Many evenings when he returned home from work, he would have all his children sit on mats in the backyard and tell us mesmerizing stories. Coffee and a joker. Dad made Folgers coffee every morning. Our house reeked of coffee, which he relished. He loved to joke around. Once when I was 7 years old, he took my sister's dollhouse teacups, suctioned them on his breast, and danced the hula hoop. My mom playfully stirred and said, Dad, take those off your breast. We all cracked up laughing. Jason. Welcoming open arms, strong, muscular, and clean. My dad worked on the railroad, but always before we went to dinner, he would shave and put on Old Spice. Dad was a constant, even though my parents divorced when I was a child. I remember Daddy standing by the door, his arms wide open, waiting for me to run or walk into them. Daddy hugging and holding me safe, even when he was in the hospital. His open arms always welcomed me. Kirsten.
You had a question?
Oh, I was just wondering if you had some other Jamaican authors in addition to yourself that you think we should read.
Oh, definitely. Allow me to read Civils, and then I'll do that. In fact, I have a few poems left over from my workshop that I could share.
Great.
They're over there. Crawling into his lap. 3 months before I turned 13 on New Year's Day, Daddy dropped and died from a heart attack. They said his smoking contributed to his early death. That musty smell that permeated his clothes. He had switched from cigarettes to pipe tobacco. He smoked all throughout the day. This memory brings tears to my eyes. I was 8 years old. Every evening, Daddy would sit in his orange upholstered chair in the living room and read the newspaper. I would crawl up under the papers and sit in Daddy's lap while he read. That was my special Daddy's girl spot. And the other Kirsten is here. Sports and flying kite. Sweaty institutional buildings, lots of players, lots of people. My father, the coach, passionate and intense, is intertwined with sports activity, especially baseball. My twin sister and I, so if you didn't know she had a twin, my twin sister and I went everywhere. And this day we were with Daddy alone flying kites, a jolly green giant kite we had saved labels off cans and sent for. The kite got away, we began to cry, and our stoic, not disposed to emotional demonstration, Dad said, "We'll look for it for 10 minutes, but we're going home if we don't find it." We found it, and our tears dried. So it is. I will definitely cherish this, and I just want to again thank each of you for coming forth and answering my questions and responding. So now there are, given the fact that we are such a small place, the Caribbean and Jamaica specifically have produced a large body of writers. But certainly one of my favorite writers, who is not Jamaican, he's actually from Barbados, but he lived in Jamaica and taught at the university for many years, is Kamau Brathwaite. And he is an experimental poet, certainly one of the most experimental poets we had. He didn't necessarily start out that way, but he emerged and won many international awards, the Griffith Award from Canada and many others. And I love his work tremendously. Lorna Goodison is a Jamaican writer, a Jamaican female writer who has lived and taught in the US, I think, for the last 30 years or so, and is just a really exceptional poet. And she's also internationally recognized and has won many awards. And she writes from a feminist point of view or a womanist point of view, but she writes. Her work is very, on the one hand, cerebral, but also very much grounded in the Jamaican landscape. Louise Bennett is deceased, but I tribute her for finding my voice. She's a Jamaican writer from the 1930s, was the first Black person that went to RADA, the British School of Performing Arts, and wrote extensively in the Jamaican nation language, or patois. And I'm actually organizing a festival for her when I go home. And so I also recommend her. You know, when you ask that question, there's so many poets and writers, and I'm blinking on some of them. Another young writer from Jamaica, Jeffrey Phillips, who is now based in Toronto. But there's you Google Caribbean writers, they can come up. Oliver Senior, a number of them. And when I did the workshop, I made copies of some of the poems, and I have a few left, so you're welcome to take those.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.